The road that snaked through a rural area was known for its calm and its isolation, but in recent weeks, something strange has started to happen. Drivers passing by reported a dark-coated dog that appeared out of nowhere, blocking the way. The animal was persistent, barking as if to warn them of something and often refusing to move out of the way of cars. The most intriguing thing was what came next. Those who dared to ignore the dog disappeared without a trace. Laura Costa, an investigative journalist, heard the rumors in a casual conversation at a gas station cafe. Curious by nature and driven by the promise of a good story, she decided to investigate. "This dog, does he always appear at night?" Laura asked the attendant, an elderly man with a weathered face. "Yes, ma'am. Almost always after sunset. And I'll tell you something. It's not a normal dog. It's like it knows something we don't," he replied, his eyes fixed on the cup of coffee in his hands. Laura wrote everything down in her battered leather notebook. It was Friday, and she decided that on Saturday night she would be on that road. Despite the gas station attendant's warnings and terrified tone, Laura wasn't afraid. For her, the supernatural was just another mystery to be solved with logic and patience. The next day, she arrived at the site in the afternoon to get to know the surroundings. The road was surrounded by dense forest, and there was something unsettling about the silence of the area. She stopped the car on a nearby shoulder and walked for a few meters. He saw nothing unusual, just tire tracks and animal footprints in the damp earth. "Maybe just a stray dog trying to survive," she muttered to herself. But deep down, something told her that there was more to the story. At dusk, Laura parked the car in the same spot and waited. The sky, lightened by the full moon, provided limited visibility, but enough to notice any movement. Then, at around des p.m., she heard a distant bark. He grabbed his camera and turned on the flashlight. The dog appeared. It was big, with yellow eyes that shone in the light of the flashlight. It walked slowly to the center of the road and started barking, looking directly at Laura. She carefully got out of the car and stood a few meters away. "What do you want? Are you trying to show me something?" Laura said, knowing she sounded crazy for talking to a dog. The animal continued to bark, now more intensely, as if in frustration. Then, unexpectedly, it turned and disappeared into the forest. Laura hesitated for a moment but decided to follow the dog's trail, even though she didn't know where it might lead. The sound of barking became more and more distant, but Laura kept going. The path the dog had entered was narrow, and the dense tangle of trees made it seem as if time had stopped there. She heard a branch break behind her and turned quickly, her heart racing. There was nothing there, but the air seemed heavier, as if the forest was alive and watching. She stopped and looked around. There was no sign of the dog now. "Should I really have come?" she thought aloud, fighting back the fear that was beginning to creep in. Before she could turn around to go back to the car, Laura heard a sound that wasn't the dog's. A low, almost whisper. A low, almost inaudible whisper that seemed to come from all directions. Laura felt cold sweat trickle down the back of her neck. The low whisper was mixed with the sound of leaves being stirred by the wind, but there was no wind. The dense forest seemed to watch her every move, as if it carried an ancient and heavy secret. Her eyes searched the darkness for the dog, but all she found were shadows. Just as she was about to give up and return to the car, she heard a loud, dry bark. It didn't come from the direction she was expecting, but from further ahead. The dog had returned, emerging from between the trees, its eyes shining in the dim light of her flashlight. This time it didn't bark aggressively. Instead, he stopped and looked at her, tilting his head slightly, as if beckoning her to follow him. "All right, big fella. Show me what you want," Laura murmured, adjusting her camera and following the animal, trying to shake off her nervousness. The dog moved quickly, almost disappearing between the bushes and forcing Laura to pick up the pace so as not to lose sight of it. The path he was following became increasingly narrow, and the low branches scratched her arms and legs. With each new step, the silence around him seemed more suffocating. There were no crickets, birds, or any natural sounds, just the occasional bark of the dog ahead. After about 10 minutes of walking, Laura spotted something unexpected. The trail ended abruptly in front of an old hut that was partially hidden by vines. The wooden building was in a state of absolute abandonment. Broken windows, fallen doors, and a roof full of holes. "What the hell is this?" Laura whispered, shining her flashlight on the facade. The dog stopped in front of the door and looked at her, barking one last time before lying down next to the entrance, as if to say, "It's up to you now." Laura hesitated. Her hands were shaking slightly as she held the flashlight. Something about that cabin felt wrong. It wasn't just the abandonment. It was as if it carried an invisible weight, an echo of pain and suffering that permeated the air. But her curiosity spoke louder. She stepped forward, the sound of her sneakers on the dry leaves deafening. Pushing the door carefully, Laura entered. The smell of mold and rotting wood was strong, but there was another odor, subtle and unsettling, that she couldn't identify. The lantern illuminated the interior of the hut, revealing broken furniture, a fireplace full of old ashes and scraps of newspapers scattered on the floor. As she approached the central table, she noticed something that caught her eye. A pile of old diaries and notebooks, some stained and yellowed by time. Laura picked up the first one and opened it. The irregular handwriting looked like that of a child. "Today we went to play at the lake, but Dad said we can't go out alone anymore. He's scared of them." She frowned and flipped through the next few pages. The texts became more chaotic, alternating between drawings of blurred human figures and interrupted sentences, as if the child was writing in haste or in fear. Further along the table, there were personal objects: a doll with a partially burnt face, an old lantern, and a small photo album. Laura opened the album and felt a chill when she saw the pictures. They showed a family: a strong-looking man, a woman with long hair and 2 children, a boy and a girl. The last photo was particularly disturbing. It showed the hut, but there was something in the background. A shadowy, almost indistinct figure blended into the forest. Laura heard a dry noise behind her. She turned with a jump, illuminating the darkness, but saw no one. Her heart raced. When she looked back at the table, the dog was standing in the doorway, his body tense and his eyes fixed on the forest. He was growling low, the fur on his neck bristling. "What now?" she whispered, swallowing. Carefully, she put the photo album in her backpack and took a few steps towards the dog. He kept looking at the forest, as if sensing something she couldn't see. Then, from outside, there was a sound. Twigs being stepped on. Heavy, human footsteps. Laura switched off the flashlight, holding her breath. Someone or something was approaching the hut. She ducked behind the partially open door, while the dog, silent now, remained motionless beside her. The footsteps stopped, and silence took over again. The only sound was her own rapid breathing. Suddenly, a deep, hoarse voice rang out. "I thought we'd settled that." Laura felt her heart stop for a second. The voice was coming from somewhere nearby, but she couldn't identify the direction. The dog growled again, low and menacing. Then the cabin door was slowly pushed open, while Laura clutched her camera as if it were a weapon. The door creaked as it slowly opened, revealing a dark figure against the moonlight filtering through the trees. Laura held her breath, trying to keep control, even though her heart was pounding in her chest. The dog next to her didn't flinch. Instead, it began to growl more intensely, like a warning. "Who's there?" The deep voice became clearer, laden with irritation and suspicion. Laura, crouched behind an overturned cupboard, clutched the camera to her chest. The man entered the hut, his footsteps echoing on the rotting wooden floor. He held a powerful flashlight, which swept the room with its beam of light. "I know there's someone here. Don't try to hide." His voice sounded threatening, but the dog took a step forward, growling louder. The man noticed. "You again, you bastard," he muttered, taking something from his pocket that looked like a small gun. Before Laura could react, the dog lunged forward, emitting a ferocious bark that echoed through the hut. The man stumbled backwards, falling awkwardly against a broken chair. Taking advantage of the moment of distraction, Laura crawled into the darkest corner of the room. With trembling fingers, she reached into her backpack and placed the diaries she had taken safely inside. The man stood up with difficulty, cursing. "You want to fight, you mongrel? I'll end this today." He pointed the gun in the dog's direction. Laura couldn't allow that to happen. Without thinking, she picked up a nearby piece of wood and threw it against the opposite wall. The sound was enough to divert the man's attention, and he turned his head abruptly. "Who's there? Show yourself!" Before he could react, the dog jumped up again, biting him hard on the arm. The gun fell to the ground, and the man screamed in pain, trying to get rid of the animal. Taking advantage of the confusion, Laura ran to the cabin door, grabbing the handle. "Damn, this is going to go badly wrong," she muttered to herself as she called the dog. "Come on, come on!" The animal let go of the man's arm and ran over to her, stopping at her side, ready to defend her again. The man, furious, was now on his feet, blood dripping from his wound. "You don't know what you've gotten yourself into! You shouldn't have come here!" he shouted. But before he could advance, Laura and the dog were already outside. The journalist ran down the path with the dog by her side, tripping over roots and branches. Behind her, she could hear the man shouting and stomping hard on the ground as he tried to catch up with them. The forest seemed even more enclosed and threatening now, every sound amplified by fear. After a few minutes of running, Laura saw something shining in the distance. It was the reflection of her car's rear lights. With her remaining strength, she accelerated, opening the car door and getting in quickly. "Let's go!" she shouted to the dog, who jumped in before she could close the door. As she started the engine, she saw the man coming out of the forest, staggering and with his eyes fixed on her. He raised an arm, but it wasn't clear what he was holding. Laura didn't wait to find out. She accelerated the car, skidding on the road and leaving the hut behind. After driving for almost half an hour, Laura parked at a brightly lit gas station, where civilization finally seemed close. Gasping, she looked at the dog beside her. "You just saved my life, you know that?" he said, with a nervous smile as he stroked the animal. The dog seemed to relax, but was still staring at the outside of the car. Laura picked up her backpack and opened her diary again. On later pages, the notes changed tone. The childish handwriting became more irregular, and the words revealed a disturbing story. "Mom says we have to be quiet. They're close again. Dad went out to talk to them, but he hasn't come back yet. I'm scared. The big man came to the hut today. He shouted at Mama and said we mustn't tell anyone anything. Mom cried." Laura felt her stomach turn. Leafing further, she found the name of the road and a reference to disappearances going back decades. The family seemed to be linked to something much bigger. She decided to do more research. She stopped at a small hotel in the nearby town, where she got an internet connection. She typed the name of the road and the cabin into a search engine. The results were limited, but revealing. He found old reports of disappearances in the region, mainly involving young women and children. No concrete clues had been found at the time. Among the scanned documents, a headline caught his eye. "Family missing for years may be linked to human trafficking ring, say investigators." Laura was breathless. The cabin, the masked man, the dog. Everything seemed to fit together, but there were still many pieces missing. Determined to dig deeper, she made digital copies of everything she found and put the diary in her backpack. Meanwhile, the dog lay down next to the bed, but remained alert, as if it was still waiting for something or someone. The next morning, Laura knew what she had to do. She would go back to the cabin. She had to find out what else that forest hid. But one thing was certain. She wouldn't be alone. Looking at the dog, she felt a strange confidence. He seemed to know more than anyone. The sky was gray when Laura returned to the country road, the dog beside her in the passenger seat. He seemed to understand the seriousness of the moment, keeping his eyes fixed on the road as if waiting for something. Laura had spent the night going over the clues found in the diary and putting together a plan. She wasn't sure what she would find, but she knew she had to get back. She parked the car in the same spot as the day before and took a deep breath before getting out. The dog immediately took the lead, moving towards the forest trail as if he already knew the way. "All right, partner, I'm with you," said Laura, adjusting her backpack. The forest seemed even more oppressive during the day, the tall trees blocking out much of the light and creating a gloomy atmosphere. As they followed the trail, Laura noticed marks on the ground, human footprints mixed with those of the dog. Her heart raced. She knew the masked man was still out there. The hut soon appeared before them, just as sinister as before. This time, Laura was prepared. She grabbed her camera and a more powerful flashlight, along with a small knife she had brought just in case. As she approached, the dog growled low, the hairs on the back of its neck bristling again. "You feel it too, don't you?" Laura whispered, trying to ignore the chill down her spine. Pushing open the door, she entered carefully. The cabin seemed untouched since her last visit, the objects still scattered on the table. However, one detail caught her eye. Fresh scratch marks on the wall next to the fireplace, as if someone or something had scraped against the wood with violence. Before she could investigate, a noise behind her made her freeze. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy, fast, and approaching. "Damn it!" Laura whispered, turning off the flashlight and hiding behind the center table. The dog positioned itself next to her, emitting a low, continuous growl. The door to the hut swung open, slamming against the wall. The masked man stood there, more menacing than before. He now held a long knife in one hand and seemed determined to find whoever had invaded his territory. "I know you're here," he shouted, his voice reverberating off the walls of the hut. "Get out now, or this will end badly for you." Laura felt panic rising, but she remained still, trying to control her breathing. The man began to rummage around, kicking broken furniture and knocking over objects as he went. "Why can't you leave it alone?" he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Laura exchanged a quick glance with the dog. He seemed to understand the critical moment, but didn't move. When the man approached the table where she was hiding, she knew she had to act. She picked up an empty bottle from the floor and threw it towards the fireplace, making a loud noise. "There you are!" shouted the man, running to the location of the sound. That was enough for Laura to come out of hiding. She ran towards the door, but before she could leave, the man caught up with her, grabbing her arm. "You're not going anywhere!" he roared, holding her tight. The dog reacted instantly, jumping on him and biting his leg. The man screamed, releasing Laura to try and get rid of the animal. Seizing the opportunity, she ran out of the hut without looking back. "Come on, kid!" she shouted, and the dog followed. But the man didn't give up. He staggered out of the hut, still holding the knife, and started chasing them down the trail. Laura ran as fast as she could, dodging branches and roots while the sound of heavy footsteps continued behind her. The dog, which was a few meters ahead, suddenly stopped and started barking furiously. Laura didn't understand why until she saw it. Further on, the trail ended in a steep ravine. "Shit!" she exclaimed, looking down into the gorge. The dog didn't hesitate. He went down the ravine with ease, jumping between the rocks and roots. Laura, on the other hand, felt fear paralyze her for a moment. "Either I jump or I die, right?" she muttered to herself, before launching herself down the ravine. She slid down the steep slope, feeling the stones cut into her hands and knees. The dog was already waiting for her below, barking for her to continue. The masked man stopped at the top of the ravine, looking down. "You're not getting away from me!" he shouted, starting to climb down carefully. Laura knew she needed a quick plan. Looking around, she saw a small tunnel between the rocks, partially hidden by bushes. "Over there," she said to the dog, who ran ahead. She crawled into the tunnel, smelling the damp, musty earth. The space was tight, but it seemed long enough to keep them hidden. After a few minutes, the sound of the man's footsteps disappeared. Laura waited until she was sure they were safe before leaving the tunnel. Their arms and legs were scratched, and their hearts were still pounding uncontrollably. But they were alive. The dog at her side licked her hand as if to say, You're all right." "Thanks, kid. You really are the hero of this story," she said, stroking his head. When they finally reached a safe place, Laura took out her cell phone and called the police, reporting what she had found in the cabin and the attempted attack. Within hours, a team of police officers was sent to the scene. They found the masked man hiding in the woods, arrested thanks to Laura's descriptions. During the investigation, they discovered that he was one of the kidnappers involved in the family disappearance case linked to the cabin. But the details of what exactly happened there were still far from being revealed. Laura knew there was still more to discover. The local police station seemed busy that morning. Police officers circulated with folders and reports, while Laura, sitting in an uncomfortable plastic chair, observed everything around her. Her dog was lying at her feet, his eyes attentive to her every move. He seemed as vigilant as she was. The masked man had been taken into custody, but his refusal to talk made everything hazier. Despite the tension, Laura kept her focus. She knew there was something bigger at stake, something that simply arresting that man wouldn't solve. "Ms. Costa?" called out one of the investigators, approaching with a serious expression. "We need you to identify some items found in the cabin." Laura nodded and followed him into a makeshift evidence room. On a metal table were objects that appeared to have been taken from the site. A stained map, rusty tools, and a locked wooden box. But what caught her eye was a folded document next to the box. She carefully picked it up and unfolded it. It was a kind of list. Names, ages, and dates. Some were crossed out with a red line, while others remained intact. At the top of the page, it read, Route 47, active. Is this real? Laura asked, holding the paper tightly. The investigator exchanged a worried glance with his colleague. "We're trying to understand it. We think it might be a list of missing persons. Route 47 had been known as a logistical corridor for smugglers for years. But this is much bigger." Laura felt a chill. The connection between the hut and the route indicated something deeper. Determined, she asked, "What about the box? Have you managed to open it?" "Not yet, but we're working on it," replied the policeman. Hours later, Laura was back at the hotel, analyzing everything that had happened. Meanwhile, the dog snuggled up next to her, as if sensing that it wasn't time to relax yet. Laura reread the diaries found in the cabin, looking for more clues. On one of the last pages, something caught her eye. It was a drawing of a road surrounded by trees, with a circle marked at what looked like a fork. Below it, a short note read, "They use this place to bring people in. They won't let us leave." With a snap, Laura realized that this could be an important place, perhaps a meeting point or some kind of hiding place. Without wasting any time, she took a photo of the drawing and sent it to the investigator who had helped her. Minutes later, she received a call. "Miss Costa, the location of the drawing seems to coincide with an intersection on Route 47. We're organizing an operation. We would like you to accompany us as a consultant, as you know the details best." Laura hesitated for a moment. The idea of returning to that place was frightening, but the desire for justice spoke louder. "All right, I'll go." The operation took place the same night. Heavily armed police surrounded the place indicated in the drawing, while Laura watched from inside a car parked at a safe distance. The dog remained by her side, restless, as if he knew something important was about to happen. When the police stormed the scene, they heard screams. Laura couldn't see anything, but the sounds were enough to send shivers down every hair on her body. After a few minutes, one of the officers came out and motioned for her to come closer. Inside the shed, the scene was devastating. 5 people, all visibly malnourished and in a state of shock, were chained to metal poles. Among them were 2 children. Police officers were working to free them while sweeping the site. Laura felt tears welling up in her eyes as she watched. It wasn't just a story. It was real life, with real victims. While the rescued were being cared for, the police found more documents that confirmed the existence of a human trafficking network. The Hut and Route 47 were just a small part of a much larger operation. The diaries, the map, and even the dog had been key pieces in exposing the scheme. However, there was one detail that still bothered Laura. Many of the names on the list found in the hut had been crossed out. Where had these people gone? And who else was involved? "This isn't over," she told the investigator, while watching the dog sniff the ground restlessly. "No, but what you did here today was the first step. Without your investigation, these people would still be there," he replied, putting his hand on her shoulder. Laura looked at the dog and felt an inexplicable connection. He wasn't just an animal. He was the key, the guide that had led her there. As she walked back to the hotel, Laura realized something. She had gained powerful enemies. Those who controlled the trafficking network wouldn't stop until they silenced her. The dog, now more than ever, seemed to understand this too. He held his head high, attentive to every sound. Laura knew that the road to the truth had only just begun. The next morning brought an uneasy tension. Laura woke up with a strange feeling, as if something was hovering over her, invisible but palpable. The dog, lying at the foot of the bed, seemed to share the same feeling. He got up as soon as she moved, his eyes fixed on the bedroom door, as if waiting for something to happen. After the rescue of the victims, Laura had become the main focus of the investigation. The diaries, documents, and list of names were now being analyzed by the federal police. But what bothered Laura most was the lack of a definitive outcome. Many of those responsible were still at large, and every step she took seemed to attract more unwanted attention. A local policeman, Sergeant Moraes, was assigned to accompany her. He met her in the small cafe of the hotel where she was staying. "We've received some information," he began, placing a tablet on the table. On the screen, there was a detailed map of the region. "These points here have been identified as possible locations used by the network. The shed on Route 47 was just one of many." Laura leaned over the table, studying the map. "Have you investigated these places?" she asked, worried. Moraes sighed. "Not yet. We don't have the resources right now. But there's something else." He hesitated, looking around before continuing. "Someone is trying to hush up this story. We received an alert last night. One of the captured suspects revealed that powerful people are involved, and they won't stop until they make sure you don't go any further." Laura felt her stomach turn but kept her composure. "They can try, but I won't stop. If they think they can intimidate someone like me, they're wrong." Shortly after her conversation with Moraes, Laura decided to go outside to relax and organize her thoughts. She took her dog for a walk in a nearby park, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave her. On the way back to the hotel, a black car slowed down next to her. The passenger window rolled down, revealing a man with a menacing gaze. "You should have stayed out of this," he said, before speeding off and disappearing around the corner. Laura stood motionless, trying to process what had just happened. The dog started barking furiously, looking in the direction the car had disappeared. It wasn't just a warning, it was a real threat. When she arrived at the hotel, she found her room ransacked. Papers were scattered all over the floor, and the satchel with her diaries had disappeared. She immediately called Moraes, who arrived a few minutes later. "This is serious," he said, as he surveyed the damage. "They're climbing over things." Laura felt her frustration grow. "This just proves that we're close to something bigger. We need to act before it's too late." Later that night, while Laura was trying to redo her notes, the dog started acting strangely. He walked in circles, growled low, and looked at the bedroom door. When Laura tried to calm him down, he ran to the window, barking into the darkness. "What now?" she muttered, approaching the window. As she looked out, she saw movement in the street. It was the same black car that had followed her earlier. This time, it was parked with its lights off. Laura grabbed her camera and took pictures of the car. But before she could do anything else, the dog ran up to the door, scratching her urgently. He wanted her to follow him. "Okay, kid, I trust you." She picked up her backpack and left. The dog ran down the street, leading her away from the hotel. Laura didn't know exactly where it was going, but she decided to trust the animal's instinct. It seemed to have a purpose, as if it knew exactly what it was doing. After walking for about half an hour, they reached an abandoned industrial area. The dog stopped in front of an old building and started barking. Laura hesitated. "Is this it? Are you sure?" The dog barked again, insistently. Laura took a deep breath and went inside. The inside of the building was dark and smelled of damp. The sound of dripping echoed through the empty space, but there was something else. Laura heard voices, faint but unmistakable. She followed the sound, with her dog by her side, until she came to a partially open metal door. Inside, she saw something that left her speechless. 2 women and a child were chained to a wall. They were weak, but alive. Laura approached them carefully, trying not to frighten them. "It's all right. I'm going to get you out of here," she said, trying to sound calm. Before she could do more, she heard heavy footsteps approaching. She turned around and saw 2 men entering the room, both armed. "What do you think you're doing here?" asked one of them, pointing his gun at her. The dog growled, advancing slowly. Laura held up her hands. "I don't want any trouble. I just want to take these people away." The men laughed, but before they could do anything, the dog attacked. It bit the leg of one of them, while Laura used the distraction to pick up a metal bar from the ground and strike the other. The fight was intense, but Laura and the dog managed to disarm them and lock them in the room before calling the police. When the police arrived, they took the criminals into custody and freed the victims. The women's accounts confirmed that they were part of the human trafficking network and that the hut was just a transit point for something much bigger. Laura, exhausted, sat on the sidewalk while the police worked. The dog lay down next to her, finally relaxing. "You're amazing, you know that?" she said, stroking its head. But the peace was short-lived. As she watched people being led to safety, an unsettling question arose. How many other victims were still out there, waiting for help? In the days following the rescue, the story of Laura and the mysterious dog made the headlines. The police revealed that the human trafficking network had been using the road for decades, and the dog, belonging to the missing family, seemed to be guiding people to reveal the truth. Laura published a detailed article on the case, bringing to light the horrors of the criminal operation and putting pressure on the authorities to capture those responsible who are still at large. The dog became a symbol of hope and courage, but after the outcome, it mysteriously disappeared, leaving Laura and the local community puzzled. The road was closed, but residents still tell the legend of the guardian dog who protects those in need. For Laura, he wasn't just a legend. He was an ally who changed the course of many lives.